And number two, now being recorded. Uh, and next, please ensure that all of our mics are going to be on mute and only go unmute when we are calling upon yourself for discussing your questions or anything you'd like to voice out your concerns. But until then, please ensure that your mic is on mute so that we have no external interference while the speaker is speaking. Next, please feel free to use the chat box for any of your questions, comments, or anything at all. This will be monitored throughout the session. I myself will be monitoring it, and we will be discussing at a later point in time. And during the session, the moderator, I, will be reading out your questions from the chat box and will be able to engage going forward. So before I continue, I just wanted to also ask what your preference is, Dweepobotee. Would you like for questions to be at the end of the session, or would you like for questions to, discuss as in when they come to us?
So I'm okay with the questioning as and when they come. Just, yeah, if someone wants to unmute themselves and ask, or if you want to read out questions from the chat, I'm okay with it.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So over to you. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Sanjana, for that warm introduction, and thank you everyone for joining today. So let me go ahead and start sharing my screen. Okay, I think you need to give me permission to share my screen.
Oh, just give me a minute. Yeah, you must have it now.
Okay, I hope my screen is visible now.
Yep, all good.
All right, so I'll be talking about academic research writing. So I'll be talking about, what are the steps going forward. It will be geared towards those of you who are starting to write for the first time, more elaborate, in-depth research articles. So if you're starting to write on, a term paper for a class, or if you're writing like a proposal for your dissertation defense, or you're starting to, write your first chapter or whatever along those lines, then, it's directed towards such candidates. So throughout my presentation, so I have some comics on the sides by Grant Snyder, who produces like wonderful comics that perfectly capture what I'm trying to say. So hopefully, they'll be useful in getting the message across. So, so let's talk about academic writing, right? So why is it important to think about academic writing separately? Why not, if you're just good at writing, if you're good, you have a good command over the language, then, this should come naturally to you. The thing is, academic articles, because they often talk about, very important concepts, something that, you have probably spent a long time studying, and you're trying to distill all of that you've studied into a paper that is supposed to get that message across to your audience. They end up being hard to read. So academic articles have this reputation of being unnecessarily obtuse. Now, you could say that, okay, I'm talking to other academics and they understand what I'm saying, so why does it matter? Well, among several other problems, what this does is it maintains the insular nature of academia. So if what you are saying is something only other academics can read, then we remain like the ivory tower. We don't get our message across. And so it will maintain the insularity of academia. And more importantly, it maintains the dissemination of ideas and engagement with the public. So it does inhibit, how many people you reach with your research and your ideas. The other side of this is that how well you've done your research, so the insights that you're putting forward in your paper, that will be judged by how you present them. So if your paper is poorly written, your analysis, your results, no one's going to believe them. So they're going to be skeptical. They're going to think that, if you're unable to explain this well to your audience, then you must not have, done a good job. And so that will hurt you. So it's important to remember that your work is judged on the basis of how well you present it. So it's important to keep that in mind when you're writing your research paper. And the thing that most people will tell you with some experience is that writing down what you've done is actually a whole lot more difficult than actually doing it. Okay, so you may have spent say, a year, a semester, or a year working on your paper. You know the nitty-gritties, you've read the literature, you know where your paper comes in, it's all in your head. And then when you sit down to actually write it, that becomes a lot harder. Okay, so start out with the idea that you should need to spend as much time and energy, if not more, at least as much time and energy in articulating your research, in writing your research, as much as you do in, in actually doing it. And so I think the little comic on the side from Calvin and Hobbes clearly tells you what I'm trying to say. So, uh, he says that he used to hate writing assignments, but now he enjoys them. And it's because he's realized that the purpose of writing is to like take inflate ideas and obscure the reasoning and clarity and all of that. And then he takes something very simple and he writes like dynamics of interbeing and monological imperatives in Dick and Jane, a study of psychic translational gender mode. So this is this is very typical of what academic articles sound like. And so it's natural that that's the article that has been like taken to denote academia. And the purpose of good writing is not to do this. So your work should not make people fall asleep, or it should not make people think that this is not for me. Okay, so your article has to be more inviting and people want to read it and not be something that obscures the point of your paper. So how do you do it? So for the rest of the talk today, I'll just go over some, bits and pieces, tips and tricks that I've learned over the years. Some of these are taken from others who've been talking about how important academic writing is, and some of it is based on my own experience. So, okay, so let's get started. So the first thing you'll need to do as you sit down to write a research paper is identify the type of writing that you do. Now, we tend to think that academic writing is mostly writing a research article or a research paper. But academic research writing does include a lot of other topics as well. Okay, so you could be writing a good literature review, you could be doing a meta-analysis, you could be writing a white paper, you could be writing, a policy brief. All of these have different types of writing style, and they have different readers. So the first thing you would need to do is to identify the type of writing you need to do. And that goes hand in hand with the average reader of your piece. So is this written for other academics like you, or is this written for a general audience, or is it written for policymakers, or is it maybe written to academics but in other fields? So identify the average reader of your piece. And then you tailor your writing style to fit the type of article that you are writing. Obviously, you can't adopt the same style for every style of writing. So you cannot write in a policy brief the same way you would write for, say, your dissertation. Or you cannot write your dissertation the way you would write, say, an op-ed. So academic writing is vastly different from creative writing. And this is an important part that sometimes when people are just starting out to write academic articles, I've seen that people often forget that. So why is it different? So creative writing is the kind of a piece where you get to show off your command over the language. Okay, so if you are someone who is like the next Shashi Tharoor and you like big grand words, creative writing is the place where you show it off. Academic writing, not so much. Okay, so it's not the place to show off your rarely used grandiose words. You keep it short, you keep it simple. And unless you are writing an opinion piece or an op-ed, you maintain a neutral, unbiased tone. So you write in as if you're an external and you are writing a report and you're presenting your work. So maintain a neutral tone and write in the present tense. So you are presenting your work to an audience. And so even though your research may have been something that has already been done in the past, write as if you and your reader are taking a journey together. And so you are guiding your reader along the way of the way you've done your research. So that's a few things to keep in mind. Okay, so if you're writing a research article, okay, the first thing that you'd have to do is to motivate the paper. So everything requires a motivation, even op-ed or a policy brief, and this should be the first thing that comes when your reader reads the paper. So talk about the motivation of the paper at the very start, preferably in the first paragraph of your introduction. Now, motivation of a research question or motivation of your research paper, this is very closely linked to how you write the entire introduction section of the paper. Now, why is this important? Because the introduction section of a paper is what a reader will use to decide whether or not to read the rest of the paper. Okay. If you are going the academic route, then this is what the referee will read to decide, how they perceive the paper. This is what an editor will read to decide whether or not to send it out to review. And if you're writing for a general audience, of course, this is where you capture their attention. Otherwise, you lose them. And so no matter how well conducted your research is, no matter how well done your analysis is, how great a data set you have, you will lose the reader if you don't motivate your question. So how do you motivate questions? How do you motivate your paper? There are a few common ways to do it. And so you talk about the question, okay? And I'll talk about how to frame the question that you can write. But there are some things that you should not do. For example, don't do what's called a bait and switch. So like don't promise something very interesting, grand, and then research and write something else. So then you are kind of misleading or deceiving your audience. So don't overpromise, don't bait and switch. Don't promise that you are going to look at X issue and then look at something that's related to X but not quite X. The other thing that's not a good way to motivate your paper is to use only a gap in the literature. Okay, so of course, all papers that you write, all research that you do should be answering a question that we don't already know. So it should be something that plugs a gap in the literature, but that cannot be the only thing. Okay, so overall, the question needs to be something important. Because this is where questions like, why do we care about this issue? Or if you describe something that happens around you, especially in economics, then readers are going to ask, so what? Right? So the motivation of your paper not only needs to discuss the issue, but how it affects people. And so write such that it answers questions like, so what? And the reader gets to know the answer. So motivation is very closely linked with how you write the introduction of the paper. Now, what is this introduction of the paper? So the introduction is where you set the stage for the rest of the paper. Okay, so just like the first act of a play, the first scene of a play which grips the audience, think of your introduction as exactly that. Okay, and it's often called the foot in the door part of the paper. So this is a part of your paper that tells your reader whether or not this is something interesting. This is the part of the paper that grabs your editor's interest. this is the part of the paper that gives an impression to the referee. So it's called the part of the paper that gets your foot into the door. So what should you do about it? You should write clearly and concisely. So don't put in long sentences, okay? But at the same time, don't talk too much about what you are going to do later on. So give them a brief, like a teaser of what you're going to do. Write clearly, concisely in short paragraphs. And if you're an economist, write for all economists and not just for those in your subfield. So your paper will most likely be read by a variety of economists, okay, not just, if you're a development economist, not just other development economists. So your introduction should be something that anybody in the field of economics reads and understands, and not just those in your subfield, okay? And in order to get your foot in the door with introduction, you need to start with something that grabs the reader's attention. So there are several issues that, there's several possible ways to do this, okay? So you could start out with, like, you talk about an issue that is important, okay? So, for example, unemployment is bad, it hurts a lot of people. So there's a inflation unemployment relationship. One rises when the other falls. And so you talk about it, you describe it. And by doing that, you're motivating the fact that the issue that you're studying is important. So that's your hook. It grabs the reader's attention. Or you could start with a puzzle. So something that happens out there in the economy, but economists still don't know why it happens. Okay. So something that's a puzzle and we're still trying to figure it out. Or you could talk about an issue that is slightly controversial. So something like maybe universal basic income. So we have some groups of economists who think it's a very good idea, some groups of economists who oppose it. So it's controversial. So you could describe the two opposing views, and that would let your reader know that, okay, this is a hotly contested issue in economics and it's important, and they will want to read further to know what you think, okay? Or it could be something like some people think an issue is good while others are bad, or some level of it is good while other levels are bad. For example, inflation. So we know that low levels of inflation can be good for the economy, but very high levels of inflation can be bad for the economy. So again, your reader will be like, okay, so if it's good, then how much of it is good? Or how do we know when something stops being good and starts becoming bad? And you grab the reader's attention and you make them want to read further. Sometimes you'll find that this stage, this introduction section of the paper often incorporates what we call a literature review or the prior literature into this section. So you sometimes look at, read a particular paper discusses the issue of Y, and then it says, okay, XYZ other papers have also looked at this, incorporate that into this section, and then move on to discuss what they have done. Or you could have a separate literature review section where you discuss the prior literature. The important thing is, whichever route you decide to take, whether you incorporate into the introduction section or you write it separately, make sure there's a connect. So tell your reader what others have done before you, tell the reader what you're going to do, and then tell the reader how those two connect. Okay, so are you going forward? Are you doing beyond what other papers have done? Why is that important? And how do you address some of the challenges that previous papers have encountered? So make sure that your introduction section clearly gives the motivation of writing the paper. Now, about research questions. So any academic article will have at least one clearly defined research question, or at least good academic articles should have at least one clearly defined research question. And this is very closely connected to the motivation of the paper. So this is why you started writing this paper. So sometimes small questions can lead to some very interesting papers. Sometimes very simple questions lead to some very interesting papers. Sometimes the questions are slightly more complicated. Either way, whatever is your motivation for writing a paper, make sure you frame the research question as a question. Okay, it has to be a question so that your reader knows exactly what you want to answer. So there should be at least one clearly defined research question. But at the same time, you can have more than one research question, but make sure you have a finite number of related research questions. So just because you're allowed to ask research questions and answer them, don't try to answer too many research questions, even if they are related in one paper, okay? Because A, you don't want to confuse your audience, and B, uh, no, the more questions you ask, your ability to answer them becomes limited in one paper. Now, how do you formulate this research question? Try to clearly write your question in terms of the words we use to ask questions. So like who, what, when, where, how, etc. So not just, in terms of like we want to explain how XYZ happens, or we want to understand how XYZ happens, but more go a little one step deeper and say, why does it happen? Or who does it affect? Or where do we see it? And how do we solve it? So asking the right questions is very important. And asking the right question is perhaps the first and the most important part of any academic study. Okay, good studies come from asking the right questions. So if it's that important, okay, if it's that important to ask a right question, if it's that important to ask good research questions, what makes a good research question? Okay, now the answer to that is not that simple. What makes a good research question is something that actually takes a lifetime to figure out. Okay. When you're at the beginning of your career, you can try to stick to the tried and tested type. So you could look at, what's the impact of a policy or an intervention that's happening. Or if you are someone in theory, then you build on an existing model, you tweak an assumption. You want to know, okay, what happens if you don't make a certain assumption about, how consumers behave or how producers behave, and so on. So there are some tried and tested methods, and you can, stick to those to motivate your research question. But remember, whatever you choose, you should clearly state it, and clearly state it multiple times over the course of your paper. So ask the research question very clearly at the beginning of the paper, and then remind your reader whenever you need to that this was the question you had asked, and that's what you're trying to answer. Okay. Feel free to jump in anytime if you have a question. Otherwise, I will just, keep this space and go on.
Hi.
The space is great. Oh, I'm so sorry. Go ahead with your question.
Can you hear me, please?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Can you elaborate a little bit more on what you mean by stick to tried and tested types when you begin your career? I want to have a broader picture. Yeah, because
So, there are some big issues that are that the discipline is grappling with. Okay, so like poverty, right? So we've been trying so many different ways to solve poverty. Okay, at the beginning of your career, asking the big questions like how do we solve poverty? It doesn't have a clear-cut answer, right? And so if you're asking something like that, you may not be able to answer that in one paper. And that's a risky thing to do because you don't yet have the risk tolerance level to try to do that in one paper. So tried and tested methods, what would they be? So suppose there has been some country has tried to do some kind of a policy or intervention to alleviate poverty. So you could focus on that intervention and see, does this one work? Okay. And then there are many different ways to measure poverty. So you see, has this intervention worked in terms of like improving health? Has this intervention worked in terms of improving like education or whatever that intervention was geared to? These are tried and tested methods. And there's a whole world of like policy and interventions and things out there whose we're always trying to find out whether or not they work and how well they work. And so they can always be very good sources of research questions. Or if you're a theoretician, okay, so you want to build a theory. So you could look at what's being done out there in terms of describing a particular agent's behavior in the model. Okay, so consumers, what do they do when they go to the market? And then what do all of these models have in common in terms of what we assume about their behavior? And then what if that changes? So you change something and you see if you can build another model that explains their behavior. So sticking to what has been done, as well as making sure you do something new, a little bit of innovation is a tried and tested method.
Yeah, that's clear. Thank you very much.
Okay. Other questions? Okay.
Yes, I think one person raised their hand and would like to discuss with you. Yes, please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Shevya. Thank you so much for your presentation. So I had a question, like you mentioned in the introduction, is the literature review a part of the introduction where we define, the scope of our research?
So some people do it, some people don't. It's up to you. Some people try to motivate, some fields often do this, they try to incorporate the literature review inside the introduction. And because you're motivating your research question is often linked closely to what is the gap in the literature, right? So if you want to talk about what is the gap in the literature, you have to discuss the literature. Like you can say, XYZ has been done by others, they haven't been able to do this, so I'm doing this. And so then you would have to talk about the literature review while motivating your research question. But some other fields like to keep it separate. So it's entirely up to you.
All right, thank you.
I think one more person has their hand raised and would like to ask your question. Please go ahead.
Hello, good evening, ma'am. I was just wondering that earlier you mentioned that plugging the gap in the existing literature shouldn't be the only thing that motivates you to write your paper, right? So I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on that.
It means that don't start your papers with the idea that, others have not looked at X. X by itself should be important enough to look at. So talk about the present state of what it is. So suppose you're looking at, I don't know, inflation. Okay. So talk about what high levels of inflation does to the economy. Okay. And then talk about how other papers have done A, B, C, they haven't done D, and so my paper is doing D. So it's important to talk about the issue by itself first and not start off as, others have not looked at so and so, and that's the only reason I'm writing this paper.
Oh, okay, thank you, ma'am.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah, I think Nitya raised their hand.
Yeah, good evening, ma'am. Thank you for the presentation. My question is, sometimes it becomes difficult to differentiate between introduction and literature review. So both of them usually end with the research question. I mean, I face this struggle most often, that I have to end the introduction also with something which conveys the either the purpose of the research paper or somewhere the objective, and I try to conclude my literature review with the exact research question. Am I doing right or wrong? So
That's how I write it. That's how
okay.
a lot of fields write it. You're right that it is sometimes very hard to dissociate the introduction from the literature review, because then what do you write in the introduction? You obviously talk about the issue a little bit. So you write one paragraph talking about what is it that you're studying and why that's a problem. Okay. And then what do you do with the other paragraphs? You can't have a section with only one paragraph. That makes no sense. So more and more papers you will find that incorporate the literature review into the introduction. In fact, you will find papers that incorporate the literature review over the course of the paper. So they will cite papers that are similar in terms of the issue that they're studying, research question that they're studying in the introduction. Then they will go on to cite papers that use the same data set as they do when they're writing the data section. Then they'll go on to cite papers that use similar methods as they when they're writing the method section or the discussion section. So it's perfectly okay. I think more and more papers we are seeing nowadays that incorporate the literature review over the course of the paper. So that's perfectly okay not to have a separate literature review section.
All right, thank you, ma'am. Also, one more doubt. We haven't yet reached findings, but my doubt is, so we do not cite papers during findings, but we do cite them during discussion. Is that so?
You can cite, well, sometimes you'll find that papers combine the findings and discussions.
With discussion, yeah.
They also combine that. So I'll talk about a little bit about citing papers during discussions.
Sure.
It's
Thank you.
often a good idea to cite papers during discussions, because then you're contrasting your result with what others have found, or comparing and contrasting.
Yes.
Okay,
Thank you.
I'll talk about it.
We just have one question that came through the comments chat box as well, from Richa. Richa, I'm just going to read out your question. You can further engage if you feel free to do so. The question reads, roughly how many research questions would be too many?
That's hard to say, but that depends on how much work you've had to do to answer them. So if you have one major research question and you have small related ones, so say you want to know, okay, say you look at the impact of a particular intervention, okay, and then you look at how it differentially affects different subgroups of the population. And so we find papers that look at many different subgroups of the population, because the effort needed to do that is not a whole lot, and the results can all be presented in one table. You can incorporate the discussion in one table or one section. However, suppose there are 3 or 4 related interventions, okay, and maybe each of them require a different approach when it comes to evaluating them. So then maybe they should be separate papers and not all in one paper. Okay.
Thank you. We got one more question on the chat box from Shruti. Shruti, I'm just going to read out your question. Feel free to go off mute and engage going forward, or even after this. So the question reads, say if we change the time period in countries we are studying of an already existing paper, but we don't have a new research question in mind, can it be considered as a new research?
Do the results change? So it matters if the results change. Okay. If you're finding, if you see that in a different time period something new is happening, then it can be a new paper. If the results don't change, then it's hard to motivate that as a new paper. I mean, you didn't do anything, you didn't find anything new.
Yep, I think that's it. Oh, thank you. I think that's it. I think we can continue. Anyone else having any other questions, feel free to post it up in the chat box and I will read it out.
Ma'am, actually, I want to follow up on my question. Yeah,
Yes, go ahead.
So, see, ma'am, so you said that if the results are different, then we might consider that a new research. But when we're just starting with that research, we don't already know the results. Then how do we decide whether it's worth, undertaking that kind of a research? Because I don't have a new question in my mind, and I'm facing problems that that I don't have a new question in my mind, and I have to make a proposal. What to do then?
So this is something that early career researchers face very often. Okay. So then this ties very closely with what I said earlier, that what makes a good research question. Okay. It actually takes a lifetime to figure this out. So is that research worth undertaking? You won't know what the results are. You could do one of two things. What do you think the results are likely to change? Okay, so this is where your understanding of the economy and economic theory comes into play. Did something happen that would make you think that something might? So, for example, was there a huge shock like something like COVID? Do you expect that? I don't know your exact research question, but do you expect that something like COVID might have changed the entire setting and the results of what a previous paper found? If the answer is yes, then you might go forward with it. But here is where you take the help of a senior academic. Go and run this idea by them. Tell them that you're looking at it. They have more experience. They have more experience in successful research. They have more experience in unsuccessful research. Okay. So one of the things that you will pick up as you progress in your career is the ability to understand what is a bad research question and when to dump them. Okay, when to dump your paper and not put in more effort because this is not leading anywhere. And that happens to a lot of people. That even happens to senior economists. It's just that with experience, senior academics get better at identifying where there is a paper and where there isn't a paper earlier on. So if you're struggling with not being able to understand whether or not there's a paper there, go talk to someone senior. Talk to them about this idea and see what they have to say.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. I think we can continue now.
All right. So, all right. So we've talked about, research questions. So now let's assume you have a research question. You've done the research. Okay. So how do you write this down? Most academic papers have a set structure. Okay. The first thing that you have to write is the first thing that comes in the paper is the abstract. Now, one thing to note here is that as you sit down to write, you don't have to write in this order. Okay. A mistake that commonly that people make at first is that they think that just because the abstract comes first, you write the abstract first. No. Typically, when we sit down to write, we write the abstract last. What do we write first? We write down the results and then we write down the discussion. And most people write the papers inside out, not outside in. Okay. So we start with the meat of the paper, the results, the discussion, and then you build around it. Okay. But when you're in the final finished form, your paper will follow this order. It'll be the abstract first, which is usually written within 150 to 200 words. It's the first impression of your paper that people get. Okay? So it's the overview of the whole paper. It will talk about the research question. It will have one sentence to motivate the issue, motivation, research question. If your data is cool enough, okay, if you're writing an empirical paper and your data is something new and cool, talk a little bit about the data. If you're writing a theoretical paper and your model is something new, talk about the model, one sentence. And then talk about what you find. What people often miss is writing down what they find. So it should have an overview of the whole paper. It's like a teaser for a movie. Okay. Again, abstract is what is used to decide whether or not to read further. And if you're someone sending the abstract to a conference, like nowadays you have conferences which do the initial screening of papers by just reading the abstract and not the whole paper. In such cases, your abstract becomes even more important, because that is what will decide whether or not your paper gets accepted into the conference. So make sure it's a first impression that people have of your paper. It should give you the overview of the paper. As you are writing the paper, return to this often. Okay. So abstracts often undergo several changes, 10-15 times. They undergo changes because as you write the paper, as you edit it, you realize that something else might be a good thing to put in the teaser of your paper, and you might go and rewrite it, or you might want to delete something because you think it's not that important to be in the abstract, right? So pay a lot of attention to the abstract of the paper, and it's a dynamic thing. It's not something you write once and you forget about it. You change it, it evolves as the paper evolves. Then the introduction section. So we talked about the introduction section. This is where you grab the reader's attention or you lose them, and you have to motivate the paper. In the introduction, again, give a preview of the results. So I had a professor in graduate school who used to say, how do you write a paper? You tell your reader what you're going to do, then you do it, then you tell the reader that you've done it. So you have to tell them what you're going to do in the introduction. So this is not like a thriller movie where you leave the main thing that you found until the end and you want to hold on to the reader's attention and have them. No, you're going to lose their attention if you don't tell them what you found. So give a preview of the result in the introduction itself. Now, prior work, you may or may not have a separate section for prior work. You may include this into the introduction. However you choose to do it, there are some things that you must do. So it's important to situate your paper. So when you're talking about other people's work, don't just report what they've done. Also tell your reader how your paper relates to what others have done. Okay. So some other paper like XYZ found that, particular intervention affects, say, neonatal mortality, but it doesn't affect infant mortality. But I find that it affects infant mortality because I use this data and this method. Compare and contrast with what others have done. Give credit to relevant work. So be liberal about, citing papers that are really in your work, in your area of work. But at the same time, don't add irrelevant papers to, inflate your citation count. Especially, don't add unrelated work by, very famous people, hoping that it's going to somehow help you. It's not. Okay. Readers as well as journal editors and referees will often find out that if it's irrelevant, then it's not going to help your case. And whatever you do, connect it to your paper. So the next section, if you're writing an empirical paper, is the data section. Now I'll talk a little bit in more details about the data section and how to write it, but that's often the more ignored section of the paper. People tend to write the data section as something, here's this data, this is what it contains, blah, blah, and here's what I'm doing. And then focus more on what they're doing. When you write the data section, make sure you mention the data clearly, but at the same time, mention the unit of observation, the frequency, the time frame, the sample size, all of the things that are related to the data. And don't leave your reader guessing, because all of this fits into how credible your work is, how credible your model is, how credible your results are, and all of that. So don't leave the reader guessing. And if you have, if you want to say present summary statistics, you can include a table in the appendix. And then you move on to the analysis and model section of the paper. So if you are writing an empirical paper, make sure to write the equation, define all of the notations, stay clear and concise. Don't repeat, but make sure you cover every result that you've obtained. And don't leave results hanging in the section that you don't discuss. In the same way, if you're writing a theory paper, define all of the notations at the outset and discuss all of your results in this section. And then the last section would be where you discuss. You end the paper, you wrap it up. You could call it, the conclusion section. You could call it the discussion section. Some people combine the two. Some people keep it separate. This is where you talk about the contribution of your paper. So this is where make sure to connect this with the motivation. So motivation was where you were trying to tell the reader that this is why your paper is important. Your discussion section, where you talk about the contribution, should say the same things. Okay. So tell them, I had promised that I would do XYZ. Here's what I've done. I've done XYZ. And this is the contribution to the literature, the value added to the literature. Repeat the results, remind the reader of what you found, and make sure it hits a home run. So connect with the introduction and the motivation of the paper. Okay. So I'll talk about a couple of these sections in a little more detail.
Just before we continue, we had a couple of questions that came through the chat box.
Yes.
Can we just quickly go through them? Okay.
Sure.
So the first one, it reads, hello, if I'm writing a research proposal, will the structure be similar?
Yes, you would not have the results section. So if you're writing a research proposal, you would not have an abstract. You would have one introduction motivation section. You would have a prior literature section, or you could combine that into the introduction section also. Ideally, you also know the data set you're using. Assuming this is an empirical paper, you would also know the data set you're using. If it's a theory paper, you would have some idea of the model that you are going to build. What kind of assumptions you will have. You will also have either one of these two sections in that paper, which will tell your reader what you are going to do. You will obviously not have a section that discusses the results. And in the conclusion section, you will have what your expected outcome of this is going to be. So if you are writing an empirical paper, what a priori you think your results might be. If you're writing a theory paper, then you can write about, what it will contribute to. So what it will add, the value addition to the literature, a priori.
We have another two-part question that came in. Part A is, so what's the key difference between an abstract and an introduction? Many times they get confused because abstracts give a brief overview and the intro also gives us a roadmap of what's inside.
Okay, that's a good question. Abstract is a very brief overview. So like 150 to 200 words roughly. Okay, so it will have one sentence that captures each of these. So one sentence that gives the motivation, one sentence that says the research question. Sometimes the two sentences are combined to make it one sentence. So you motivate and ask the question at the same time. You talk about the data, you talk about what you found. A very brief introduction, a very brief overview. Introduction builds up the paper. The roadmap is a separate paragraph that comes at the end of the introduction, and I'll talk about it. Introduction is a longer overview. Each paragraph should pick up an idea. So the first paragraph can be where you motivate the research question or where you motivate the issue. Then you can have a paragraph which motivates the question that you ask. And then you can have a paragraph which talks about the prior research. And then you can have a paragraph which talks about the value added to the research. So the first paragraph can be where you motivate the research question or where you motivate the issue. Then you can have a paragraph which motivates the question that you ask. And then you can have a paragraph which talks about the prior research. And then you can have a paragraph which talks about the roadmap of the paper. Now, roadmap is something else, and I'll talk about that in a second. Okay. So I hope that clarifies the difference.
The second part of this question is, how do we choose or know what is an important paper versus what is not?
So this has to do with learning how to do a good literature review. Look for papers that have asked a question that is very similar to the question you are asking. If you are doing impact evaluation, then it's probably looking at the same policy or very similar policies in other countries. You can motivate it by, you can also pick papers that have used similar data sets, papers that have done similar techniques, empirical techniques, papers that have found similar results in other contexts, or papers that have done the similar thing but have found opposite results. So they've used a similar intervention, similar data set, but they found a different result. So your research is a contrast to that. If you're writing a theory paper, so you would be building off a model. So obviously papers that have, that is the, the seminal paper on that, in that area, as well as other papers that have also built off that model, and how those are different from the ones from what you are doing.
Thank you. I think one person raised their hand. Please go ahead.
Hi, so I wanted to ask about the literature review as well. So I have like two small related questions. One is that if I'm citing a paper and I find that there are 2 or 3 very similar papers that have the same results, do I need to talk about all of them in detail, or should I just mention them in passing or something? And
you can mention them in passing in one sentence. So like X, suppose 3 papers. Okay, so X comma Y comma Z. Look at the effect of A over B and found D.
Right. And the other thing was, how would I what the order would be in the literature review? Like, do I go chronologically, or do I go like most relevant to least relevant?
No, there's no order in the literature review section. Obviously, you order them when you write the names in the appendix or bibliography, where you cite them. So then you typically cite in alphabetical order. When you are citing them in the text, when you are telling your readers what others have done, there is no order. You plug in citations wherever they are relevant to the point you are making in that sentence.
Sorry, I didn't mean citations. I meant like when I'm talking about prior literature. So do I need to talk about what is the most relevant literature to my paper and then talk about other papers? Or should I go like, this is how the debate has been evolving in the field and like that?
Okay. That's a good question. That depends on your paper. So is your paper following the chronology in which the debate has evolved in the literature and now is adding to the endpoint? Or is your paper pulling in things from different subfields? Okay, so if your paper is pulling in things from different subfields, then you cite inside out. So you cite the most relevant first, then you cite slightly less relevant, then slightly less relevant when you write the literature review section.
Okay,
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does.
Thanks. I think we can go on to the next slide. I don't think.
So, in using the literature review section, you are actually building a story. So this entire paper is, although academic papers don't feel like that, but you're actually telling a story, okay? And you are the author, you are the storyteller. So you have some freedom in how you choose to tell the story, okay? You can choose to follow the chronology that literature has taken, or you can break away from it and pick and choose whichever is most relevant to you and cite it accordingly. So you have some freedom over there. What you should make sure is that it flows neatly. It flows well. It should not feel disconnected to your reader. And I'll give you some tips on how to do that. Okay. So okay. So if there are no other questions, I can continue. Right. So the data section of the paper. If you're writing an empirical paper, now we often end up writing the data section of the paper to be very dry. Like we just tell our reader, okay, I'm using XYZ data from this round, and this is what I'm doing, and that's it. And then we move on to our model. But it doesn't have to be that dry, okay? And nowadays, with more and more people collecting their own data or finding clever new data, this section of your paper can actually be very cool, okay? So for empirical papers, it can be an important selling point of your paper, especially if you have a unique data set that others haven't found, or if you have compiled the data yourself. So how can you make this section cool? So start by reminding your reader about the research question. Okay, tell them that this is what you're asking, and then connect this to the empirical model. If you are doing some causal work, then connect it to the identification strategy, which will tell you what's the ideal kind of data that you need to do this. Okay, so if you're asking this research question, here's how you would answer it, and this is the ideal data set that you would need. And then describe how close your data set is to that ideal data set. You know, if you have the perfect data set, great, good luck, go ahead and get started. If you don't have the perfect data set, talk about what are the barriers to getting to that data set. So maybe it's an administrative data set that only one company has and they don't give access to you. Or, it could be a kind of data set that isn't collected in the world. And so you have to find some other way to get at it. If it's a cool data set, if it's unique, if it's new, brag about your data set a little. Trust me, it will help sell your paper, okay? Or some clever strategy that you have come up with, which bypasses the barrier to getting the data. Or you could have a clever empirical strategy, which overcomes the fact that your data set wasn't, you didn't get the ideal data. So connect it with the research question, connect it with what data you wish you had, okay? Because if you're writing empirical papers, we end up writing papers with the data we have, okay? We can't write papers with the data we wish we had. Although data set is often the most, it's the part that constrains us. So talk about what your ideal data set would be and connect it to what you currently have, and make your reader envious of your data set. And then present the data sources and summary statistics, okay? All right. And assuming then you talk about your results. Now this is the results, and results section is a very, it's dependent on your research question. So that's going to be very different for everyone. And then you come to what's the discussion and conclusion section of the paper. Now, some people have one section that discusses and concludes. Some people have a separate section where they present and discuss results, and they have a separate conclusion section. So here, often it's a neglected part of the paper. So by the time we reach the conclusion section of the paper, we are exhausted, and we just hurriedly write something and send it forward. So how do you make sure that you write a good contribution section? Remember, your paper has to hit a home run, which means you have to go back to where you started. So here you summarize the results, you highlight what you have done, highlight the contribution. So you started your paper with a research question, you told your reader, this is what I was going to do. And so remind them that you have done that. If it's a paper that has implications for policy making, then highlight that. If it's a paper where there are some limitations, which your paper will have, no paper is perfect, okay? And no paper answers or addresses all the questions that you need. So if there are some limitations, Discuss those limitations. And in that line, discuss what this means for future research. Now, why is this important? Because your paper, the end point of your paper, can be the starting point of someone else's paper. And in fact, for those of you who are starting out, a good place to look for research ideas is in the conclusion section of other papers. So people have written papers before you where they have, in the area that you are interested in, where they have left an open question for the audience or for the next researcher. You can look for those easy, low-hanging fruit that will give you an idea of a good research question. So make sure you end your paper on a positive note, on a note that wraps up the work that you've done so far. Okay. So that brings you to the end of, say, what you have as a first draft. Now, no first draft is ever good enough to go forward. Okay. Like it's not going to be your first draft. Trust me, it's not. It was never a first draft that won a Nobel Prize. Okay. No great paper emerges from the author's desk in that form. It gets rewritten and rewritten at least 10, 15 times, maybe even more. Okay. So as you are writing your paper, be ready to edit. Be ready to understand that the final version of this paper may not look anything like the first version of your paper. Be your own worst critic, because if you are not your own worst critic, someone else will be. Okay. So edit your paper liberally. One good way to do that is make a friend, make a supportive friend or a classmate who is going to be your critic, and you can be that person's critic. Okay. And you'll see that two sets of eyes are always better than one. So you may not always find all of your own mistakes, but your friend will find your mistakes and you will find your friend's mistakes. Okay. As you go forward in your career, you'll find other people who you can send your drafts to, who will give you feedback on this, on your work. So always get someone supportive to help out. Now, what about the tone of the paper? Remember, you are a lawyer for your paper, for your research question. Most papers are an exercise in persuasion. Even though you don't write that in that tone, even though you're not writing it as a persuasive tone, your job through your paper is to convince your reader about the results. And so remind yourself this when you're writing. So you are the lawyer for your research question, your data, and your empirical techniques. So you have to defend it in terms of all the questions that might arise in a reader's mind. In terms of writing, okay, actually sitting down and writing, write small paragraphs and small sentences. Okay, so don't write long meandering sentences, because your reader might lose their train of thought while following that sentence. So it's always better to write small paragraphs and small sentences. Make sure each paragraph covers one point. Okay, so it should be a topic sentence at the beginning of every paragraph where that sentence captures what you are saying in that sentence, in that paragraph. And then other sentences in the paragraph should support it. So make sure you're making one point in one paragraph. Don't go back and forth, and avoid repetition at all costs. So if you've made a point once, that's it. You can remind the reader of the research question here and there, or you can remind the reader of what you've done in short at some other point of your in your paper. But do not rewrite or try to reconvince your reader of the point over and over again. So that's the kind of repetition to avoid at all costs. Okay, so we've talked about writing, getting your first draft out, okay, editing it. What do you call your paper? So every paper has to have a nice name. Why is that important? The title of your paper plays a very important role in generating interest in the reader. So choose wisely, okay? The thing to always remember is that your paper's title should accurately reflect what you do. Don't make it too long. So not, I think 10 to 12 words is a rule of thumb that most people use, not longer than that. You can use metaphors or popular culture references, okay? So I think my favorite name for a paper is The Silence of the Lambdas. Okay, so those of you who are movie buffs and you know that that's a reference to Silence of the Lambs, the movie. So you're allowed to make, metaphors and cool references in your paper names, but make sure they fit. Okay, so it should not be a stretch, because then, you lose the point. And don't get married to the idea of a cool name. So your paper may change as you are writing it. And then the title of the paper might also change. So it changes over the life cycle of the paper to reflect the changes in the results and contributions. So choose this last. Choose the name of your paper last, okay? Get your first draft out of the way, write it, edit it. When you're ready to send it out for review to externals, like a professor or someone, then you can choose the name of your paper. Now, all of this is about the title of the paper. What do you call the draft that's on your computer? Okay. Now, your paper, as I said, is going to undergo many changes. Okay. So follow a naming convention for the file for intermediate drafts. Okay. So one bad thing to do is like naming it final draft, because nothing's ever final. You're going to have like a final part 2, final part 1, final version 2, etc. So whatever works for you, choose a naming convention for the drafts, because trust me, there is going to be many drafts on your computer until you submit the paper somewhere. Sometimes the paper will come back rejected and then you have to redo it and there'll be more drafts. So follow a consistent naming convention for the sake of the future you, so that you don't get confused. Okay. Right. So importance of names, not just the title of the paper, but also the file and how you name it. All right. So a few tips to, help you out. Something that I've learned over the course, something that, my teachers, advisors, mentors have told me, something that others have followed and found, good results. Don't start writing too close to a deadline. Write a little bit every day, okay? You do not have to write your entire paper in one sitting. In fact, you will most likely not be able to write your entire paper in one sitting. So write the paper as you do the research. One paragraph, one sentence, write a little bit as it evolves. Try to finish a draft several days before a deadline and keep it away, keep it aside for a few days and get some distance from it, okay? So go do something else, like go watch a movie, just leave it on your computer, okay? And then when you come back to it after a few days, you will be able to get a fresh perspective on that thing, and you might even be able to catch some of your own mistakes. So when we spend too much time on one article, we develop a kind of tunnel vision about it. Okay? So we are unable to see our own mistakes because we are the ones who just wrote it. So taking a step back, letting your brain forget some parts of it for a while is a good idea. Then you come back to it with a fresh perspective. Remember, editing is a very important part of writing. So writing is writing, editing is writing, deleting is writing. If something doesn't sit well, if you think a sentence doesn't quite capture it and you deleted it, that's fine. In fact, sometimes some of you might be writing your dissertation, you'll see that you'll spend an entire day deleting stuff that you thought once was very important. Consider that to be a productive day and a part of writing. Okay. Now, don't shy away from using equations, especially in economics, but make sure to explain in words what your method does. So don't just only write an equation and leave it hanging there. Okay. Write the notation, like define the notation and write what it does. Try to include as many graphs and pictures as you can. So from the point of view of the reader, pictures, graphs are far better than explaining something in a table, which is far better than writing it in words. So pictures are better than tables, which are better than just plain text. Include a roadmap of your paper. So this is what I was talking about when I said a roadmap is something very specific. And it's usually the last paragraph of the introduction section. So what is a roadmap of the paper? It reads something like section 2 talks about the data set. Section 3 talks about the empirical strategy. Section 4 talks about this and that. Okay. And section 5 or 6 concludes. You have a small paragraph with these few sentences. Every paper has, or most papers have this. It might sound annoying at first, but this is a very important thing to include in your paper. Why is that? As you write papers, you will also read papers. Now, no one reads the entire paper, every paper from start to finish, because you will never finish. So the roadmap of the paper tells your reader where to look for the thing that they came to your paper for. So someone might come to your paper because they want to see your results, what you found. Someone might have come to your paper because they wanted to know what data set you used. Someone might have come to your paper because they wanted to see what empirical method they used. The roadmap of the paper tells your reader where to find that, and make sure to always include it. Okay. In order to write well, you have to read a lot. So you have to read good papers. Whenever you take a class that has a reading component to it, you're usually reading the best papers in the field. So you will end up reading good papers because they tell you what to do. Read bad papers. They tell you what not to do. So read a lot of papers. Okay. When it comes to citation, cite liberally. Don't be stingy about citing. So cite liberally every paper that you think is relevant to what you're doing. Cite well. So give credit where credit is due. Cite right. Cite it in the right format. And one thing that a lot of people don't do is cite data and software. Make sure to do that. Data and software are also intellectual contributions. Okay, especially if someone has taken the pain to collect the data on their own and now they've given it to the public to use and you're using it, cite their data. If you're using software, especially something that has been user created, like in Stata or R or Python, cite software, cite packages. Okay, those are also intellectual contributions that you are using in your paper. Make sure to cite them. Okay, so we're towards the end, right? So I put this picture here with no words because I think it tells you exactly what I want to say. So writing a paper is hard. Okay, like I said, the writing is sometimes it takes as much time as doing. And people suffer from writer's block in technical writing and academic writing, just like you suffer from writer's block in creative writing. Okay. So the hardest part in writing any paper is just getting started. And every great paper that you read, okay, was once a blank sheet of paper. So the hardest part is just putting your pen or, you're putting your cursor on it and starting. Once you have overcome that, you have done the hard job. And slowly, you'll be able to build it to the paper that you are planning to write. Okay. So hope this has been useful. There are lots of resources out there that can help you get started. Some of these I've put linked here on the slides, and there's a world of wealth of information out there. Some famous economists like Mark Belmer has a blog that teaches you how to write. He actually has a book coming out that will also cover some of this. And then there's Claudia Sam's blog, and then there's Amanda's blog, which talk about how to write a good applied micro paper. This is by Jessie. Amanda talks about just writing papers in general. Claudia talks about writing macro papers. Larry and Claudia have important rules of writing your job market paper. So these are just some of the resources. There's a wealth of other information out there. Go to them time to time as you write your first research paper, term paper, dissertation, whatnot. So I'll stop here. If you have any follow-up questions, you can contact me at my email or on Twitter. And okay, I'll stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, I think someone just asked about the recording of this session. I presume that it will be as on Women in Econ and Policies Cloud, but I'm not too sure. If anyone in specific would like recordings sent to them, could you just direct message me with your email ID? I will take note of that and I will email it to you when I get the recording myself. So just very quickly, this point of the session, we're opening up the floor to direct questions and comments. We will be for the next 5 minutes, and then we will be wrapping up the session. So please go ahead and directly unmute. Yes, go ahead. I think someone raised their hand.
Yeah. So ma'am, you mentioned that the last paragraph of your introduction should be a roadmap to the paper. So is a roadmap like a descriptive index? So
it's very simple. It's like you say, so introduction is typically your first section of the paper, right? So you say section 2 discusses, say, data. Section 3 discusses methods, the empirical strategy. Section 4 discusses results. Section 5 concludes the paper. Just 3 or 4 sentences that say what the next and the next and the next section does. That's the roadmap. That's it.
Okay, ma'am, another question. You said that we should read a lot of papers in order to get good insight, right? And you mentioned that we should read good papers as well as bad papers. Yes. Is there, where do I find bad papers?
That's a good question. It's not that hard to find, but it's hard to find when you try to find them. If you're looking for papers in a journal, okay, you're going to find the best papers because there's a selection bias. They've gone through a very good vetting process and the best ones make it to journals. But you'll find a lot of other papers just floating around on the internet. So people write it and they put it up there. It's usually the first draft or the second draft. Okay. So take a topic and Google the topic. Leave aside all the links that are from journals and just links to people putting up a draft, working paper versions.
Okay, all right, ma'am.
You'll find not so well written, not so refined papers.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I just wanted to thank you for this very insightful session. I think I will connect with you later regarding other things. Thank you again.
Sure, absolutely.
Thanks. So everyone, we have time for unfortunately just one more question, and then I think we'll be wrapping up the session. I mean, if anyone would like to ask a question, you don't need to post in the chat box. You can just directly go off mute and we can discuss.
Yeah, I have a question. Can I go on?
Go ahead.
All right. So, plagiarism is actually a big deal. So, regarding citing references, right? Regarding citation, so is it okay to cite the paper which you find something, or you would have to cite the chain? For example, you find something in a particular paper, the person is also citing it from somewhere. So is it okay to just cite where you find it, or cite the chain at which it came from? I don't know if you understand what I mean.
Not quite. So suppose, okay, let me rephrase your question and ask you back. So suppose you have paper A that has cited some result from paper B, and you're asking if you want to cite, if you should cite A or B, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay,
Or
so
if you
that
should
depends
cite A
upon,
and B.
okay, so now that depends upon what is the point that you're trying to make. Whose contribution was it? So was it B that originally said what you were trying to cite, or was it A who originally said what you're trying to cite? If it's a combination of both of them, if B said something, A built on it, and you are also using it, you cite both of them. If B was the first one to cite, who made that contribution, A just used that contribution but didn't add anything to it, then you cite B. Okay, so you cite the person or whichever paper made that original contribution.
Yeah, that's very clear. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry, someone saying something? Oh, great. Cool. I think with that we will be closing the session for today. And yes, I think your email is also posted in the chat box. Thank you so much for taking this extremely informative session for all of us, and thank you for adding your extremely interesting graphics and comics here as well. Loved it so much. It really added so much more to the flavor of the discussion we're having today, which is so important. Thank you so much, and it's been amazing. Again, just before I close the session, if anyone would like any the recordings to be sent to them, please do send your email ID on the chat box directly to me. I think I've got 4 requests so far. I will be emailing it to you separately. Once again, thank you so much, all of you, for attending today's session. Really looking forward to the next coming sessions as well, and hope you all have an amazing weekend ahead.